For the last month, if not longer, the media space has been constantly flooded with news about how Belarus is preparing to attack Ukraine, and that supposedly there are only a few weeks left until the so-called D-Day. In other words, they claim that a new devastating march on Kyiv is being prepared, even more intense than the one that happened 4 years ago. Against the backdrop of these statements, the Ukrainian authorities have strengthened security measures along the northern border, and even carried out checks on the local population to make sure that people like various Gherkin types don't slip through the Pripyat swamps. And all these activities, strangely enough, coincide with the timing of nuclear exercises taking place on the territory of Belarus. It's kind of creepy though. That's why in this video we'll look into whether a new attack on Ukraine from the north is really being prepared and how realistic an actual military clash between Ukraine and Belarus is. Let's dig deeper and see if the half-baked mustache dictator really needs a war with his southern neighbor. We'll also analyze various unlikely scenarios, no matter how absurd they may seem. And finally, of course, we'll spend some time on the notorious nuclear factor in the Belarusian wilderness. My name is Semyon, this is Mikosho TV. Let's start our analytical review. Only facts and nothing more. The Bulba Führer is not the same anymore. Before analyzing the danger of the attack itself, we need to understand what exactly has been driving the mustache dictator for the past 4+ years, since the very day when Russian tanks rolled toward Kyiv and Chernihiv from Belarusian soil. By the way, it was at that moment that Lukashenko broke one of his most famous promises, saying that if he ever crossed the border into Ukraine, it would only be on a tractor. But on that gloomy morning, February 4, 2022, anything but tractors came from the Belarusian side, and they even had the letter V on their sides. But as soon as it became clear that Kyiv couldn't be taken in 3 days or even 3 weeks, Putin immediately started putting pressure on his loyal lackey, with the demand to truly join the war himself and send Belarusian troops to help their Russian brothers, who almost got surrounded on the right bank of the Dnipro. Especially since there was and still is a formal pretext. Belarus is a member of the CSTO, which is the Russian equivalent of NATO. And that means if things get heated somewhere, you have to come to your buddy's aid. Although Article 4 of this very notorious collective security treaty only provides for collective assistance if a member state is subjected to aggression on its own territory. But you and I both know very well that Moscow likes to interpret all these legal obligations and agreements in its own way. They answer to no one and do whatever they want. Just remember how many Russian-Ukrainian treaties and other agreements were signed, where it was clearly stated in black and white that both states pledged to respect each other's territorial integrity and the inviolability of the borders between them. If you don't believe me, at least read the so-called Big Treaty, signed by Yeltsin and Kuchma back in 1997. But anyway, let's get back to our sheep, or rather, to the cockroaches. Then, in the spring of 2022, the Belarusian top mustachioed leader still showed some signs of political wisdom, or maybe it was just self-preservation instinct, and he found the strength to say a firm no to Putin. Instead of sending his own soldiers, he offered Moscow anything they wanted, just not direct involvement in the military actions. All Belarusian factories were loaded to the brim with Russian defense orders. Russian drones often fly through the territory of Belarus, and in the first months of the war, missiles did as well. Plus, repairing damaged equipment, producing and supplying missing components for the Russian army, training and treating Russian soldiers, and in some cases, bypassing Western sanctions. All these options have been successfully implemented for 5 years now, but at the same time, the red line still hasn't been crossed. There are many reasons why Alexander Grigorievich went from being such a super tough militant macho to a kind grandfather from a collective farm. And first of all, of course, it's the weakness and small size of the Belarusian army itself. Their active personnel make up only 15%, 20,000 combat-ready troops. Their weakness and small numbers, their participation in the war, can't radically change the course of hostilities for Russia, but at the same time, it would completely expose Belarus itself to possible strikes from Ukraine. And declaring mobilization at home is a very thankless and extremely risky thing to do. An example of this is not only the Russian-style mobilization in the fall of 2022, but also the senseless recruitment of cannon fodder from the territories of the DPR and LPR. We have a recent video about this lawlessness on our channel. I highly recommend watching it. At the same time, find out how realistic the resumption of mobilization in Russia is in the near term. As for potential mobilization in Belarus, another restraining factor is that the overwhelming majority of Belarusian society and Lukashenko's elites are also not anti-Ukrainian, far from it. Moreover, many ordinary citizens almost openly sympathize with Ukraine. Or at the very least, they have a neutral to positive attitude. Therefore, sending tens of thousands of non-loyal Belarusians to the front could provoke not only mass social protests in Belarus itself, but also lead to desertion among such soldiers. All the more so because quite a few of their compatriots are also fighting on the side of Ukraine. The Kalinovsky regiment is an example of this. But again, there is another reason why Lukashenko is not rushing headlong into this. It's a strategic reason. If, of course, he is still capable of thinking strategically. The cockroach dictator doesn't want to lose the last remnants of his independence and tries to maintain at least some relative autonomy in internal affairs. That is, figuratively speaking, Lukashenko wants to be like Mussolini under Hitler, but by no means a Gauleiter of some hypothetical Bavaria during the Third Reich. It is also quite possible that Lukashenko wants to repeat the fate of another dictator, the Spanish one. In his time, Generalissimo Francisco Franco not only managed to outlive Hitler, but also ruled for the next 30 years. And all because, back then, he showed foresight and did not send Spanish soldiers into the meat grinder of World War II. Maybe Lukashenko also wants to outlive Putin and keep Belarus under his control until his dying day, and ideally pass power to his beloved Kolenko, who will soon turn 22. Well, you never know what fate has in store. Policy is a godforsaken place. Another thing to pay attention to is the features of the terrain. It's no secret that the northern part of Ukraine and accordingly the southern part of Belarus are located within Polesy. And Polesy, mind you, is the largest remaining forest area in Europe. It's like a European Amazon, a wild and sparsely populated area, endless forests and swamps. For any conqueror, such a land is a death trap. This has been known since ancient times, so people tried to bypass Polesy from the north, modern Poland and Lithuania, or the south, Ukraine. Napoleon, for example, advanced on Moscow from the north and avoided turning south, despite Ukraine's reputation as the Russian Empire's breadbasket. Hitler's troops bypassed the Pripyat marshes from both the north and south simultaneously, never attacking head-on. Therefore, considering that the length of the Belarusian-Ukrainian border exceeds 1,000 kilometers, it can be stated that this is generally the most difficult terrain for conducting warfare. Moreover, geography will always play a key role specifically on the side of the defenders. For the attackers, it will be certain doom. In spring and autumn, due to constant flooding, the groundwater level in the forest is at its highest. Any equipment simply cannot leave the paved roads physically because it will get stuck instantly. If we consider only the highways, there are only 4 directions for an offensive, 2 of which Russia has already tried to use. This is the route from Homel to Chernihiv and from there to Kiev. And the most well-known one is through the Chernobyl zone to Busha and Irpin. How it all ended, you know just as well as I do. Plus, there are 2 more roads that don't really pose a direct threat to Kiev. But hypothetical strikes in these directions could significantly slow down the delivery of military aid from the west, from the Polish border. These are the roads from Mozyr towards Ovruch and Korostin, as well as from Brest to Kovel. But all this is theory. In practice, tying military offensives strictly to narrow supply corridors means dooming yourself to inevitable defeat in advance. Without reliable logistics, even the most well-thought-out military plans aren't worth a dime. Just remember the famous 60-kilometer-long Russian convoy that stretched on the approaches to the Ukrainian capital in 2022. While tanks and APCs stood in a giant traffic jam for days, Ukrainian shells and drones were flying at them from all sides. This, in fact, led not just to a retreat, but to the Russians fleeing from around Kiev. Additionally, during the 4 years of the current war, Ukraine has transformed its section of Polesya into a fortified zone. The highways have long been blocked, the bridges blown up, and the border zone has been turned into dense minefields. It's simply impossible to get through the narrow passages between the swamps without massive losses. It's hard to imagine a more perfect place for defense. You want to, but it's risky. And now, taking all these factors into account, let's answer a simple question. Is a renewed attack on Ukraine possible from the north? At least in the middle of summer, when the dirt roads dry out a bit, or in winter if there are strong frosts, even with a combination of the most favorable factors for an invasion. Objectively speaking, Putin really would like to repeat the march on Kyiv, only this time he wants to make it truly triumphant. With a mandatory victory parade on Kreshchatyk and Maidan, and to raise the tricolor over the Verkhovna Rada building. Neither the Donbass bombed to ruins, nor even the sacred Crimea are worth even half as much as the significance that the mother of Russian cities holds for the Orthodox Tsar. Such a trophy is truly worth any sacrifice. Although Moscow never really cared much about casualties anyway, if anything, as is well known, Russian women will just give birth to more. However, as the centuries-long experience of world history shows, wanting something and being able to do it are two completely different things, and very often they are complete opposites. As we have already discussed above, the likelihood that Lukashenko will send Belarusian soldiers into battle is extremely low. Therefore, the only time-tested option left is the entry of Russian and only Russian troops from the direction of Belarus, just like 4 years ago. But here's the problem. For such an adventure to succeed, you need at least 500,000 soldiers. This takes into account that in 2022, the strike group aimed at Kyiv did not exceed 40,000 people. And back then, there were no real fortifications at all. Hardly anyone in the Ukrainian leadership expected a treacherous attack from the direction of Belarus. But now the situation is completely different. In order to concentrate not even 500,000 but at least 200,000 troops on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, they need to be found somewhere. No matter how huge and bottomless Russia may seem, soldiers there don't multiply by budding like strawberries in a garden. Therefore, they either need to announce another mobilization or withdraw troops from active parts of the front, and first of all, of course, from Donbass. As for mobilization, I'll repeat again. Yes, Putin's cronies are keeping this option in mind and preparing the necessary groundwork. But in the coming months, at least until the end of the spring-summer campaign of 2026 and the State Duma elections, they will not start it. But if Putin still intends to transfer troops from Donbass to Belarus, then firstly, it definitely won't be possible to do it quickly. Remember that in the spring of 2022, Russia was doing the opposite, from Belarus to Donbass over the course of an entire month. And under the current conditions, when Ukrainian mid-range strikes can reach a significant share of rear-area logistics, this process will drag on at least until autumn. And also, part of the Russian forces will simply be destroyed on the way to their destination. And then the autumn rains will come, there will be mud again, the swamps will get bigger, and the dirt roads will become completely impassable. Secondly, and this is probably even more important, nowadays it's impossible to redeploy and concentrate even a few thousand soldiers without the enemy finding out. First and foremost, this is made possible by satellite intelligence data, which the US continues to regularly provide to Ukraine. They will detect any movements of Russian troops at the very early stages, and of course, there's also the drone factor. The massive use of drones by both warring sides for several years has made the battlefield absolutely sterile and visible not just for a kilometer, but for dozens of kilometers. It is precisely the control from drones that prevents either Ukraine or Russia from secretly amassing enough forces for a sudden operational breakthrough at the front. As a result, there is a strategic stalemate and a war of attrition reminiscent of World War I. And there's one more secondary but still important factor. The redeployment of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory puts an end to Putin's plans to carry out his much-touted liberation of Donbass by the end of this year, which was publicly announced. Because there simply won't be any forces left to advance on Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Moreover, the reduction in the number of occupiers on the front will inevitably open up a real opportunity for Ukraine to begin liberating its own territory. Perhaps even in the spirit of the famous Kharkiv counteroffensive, which became possible precisely because the front lines were thinly manned by Russian troops. As a result, if we do not take into account the Belarusian army, which is already small, Russia simply will not be able to physically open a new front in the north in the coming month. And even more so, repeat its shameful march on Kyiv. A much more likely scenario would be the more active use of Belarusian territory for massive missile and drone strikes against Ukraine. From there, it's much closer to both Kyiv and western Ukraine than from Russia itself. This option cannot be completely ruled out. Let's play devil's advocate. The thing is, some Kremlin propagandists claim that by making statements about a possible attack from Belarus, the Ukrainian authorities are actually covering up preparations for their own invasion, aiming to topple Lukashenko's regime by force. And then, using the enemy's playbook, justify their attack by claiming the need for a preemptive strike, just like Lukashenko himself said back then. Like, give me a map and I'll show you where the attack was being prepared from. By the way, he still hasn't shown that map. That's how it is, that's the thing, go figure. And even though such accusations are completely soaked in conspiracy theories, we will specifically model a similar situation so that no one has any more doubts about how absurd they are. At first glance, it seems highly beneficial for Ukraine to replace the mustachioed old man who's been sitting in the presidential chair even longer than Putin has been in the Kremlin since 1994. And by doing so, surely secure its northern borders from another attack. And from time to time, there are also calls in Ukrainian media to strike the Mazer oil refinery in Belarus, which supplies fuel to the Russian market among others, as well as Belarusian military factories that serve the needs of the Russian army. However, even in this case, a perfectly reasonable and fair theory inevitably collides with the harsh realities of life. The scenario of a direct invasion of Belarus poses obvious and enormous threats to Ukraine itself. To capture Minsk and overthrow Lukashenko, which is necessary before opening a new front, the armed forces of Ukraine would need to commit hundreds of thousands of troops, despite already facing major personnel shortages elsewhere. At the same time, Belarus will quite likely be able to quickly mobilize at least several tens of thousands of reservists, which will be enough for defense and to stabilize the situation for the time being, while a full-scale mobilization is carried out. Russian troops will also almost certainly be immediately deployed to the territory of Belarus. In that case, Ukraine will face a new, huge front more than 1,000 kilometers long, where it will be opposed by at least 100,000-strong Belarusian army, which will greatly worsen the Ukrainian army's problems with a shortage of soldiers. Moreover, in that case, everything that can fly will definitely be launched from Belarusian territory against Ukraine, drones, missiles, and glide bombs, and the flight time from there to Kyiv and to the western Ukrainian cities is very short. Strikes on all logistics along the Ukrainian-Polish border will also definitely intensify. And I especially want to warn hotheads who think that grateful Belarusians will greet Ukrainian troops with flowers as liberators from Lukashenko's dictatorship. I'll say this: if Ukraine starts the invasion first, those expectations will most likely not be met, and the reaction will be exactly the opposite, just like in Ukraine after Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Or take a more recent example, Iran. The successful elimination of the much-hated Ayatollah did not lead to a nationwide uprising or a palace coup among the elites. And even, on the contrary, the very fact of the attack by the US and Israel actually led to a strengthening of the dictatorship, to the unification of society in the face of an external enemy. So even a superficial analysis shows that an attack by Ukraine on Belarus under the current circumstances is not only pointless, but also extremely dangerous for Ukraine itself. Yes, Ukraine is preparing for a potential war with Belarus, or rather, with Russian troops who could theoretically once again enter the territory of Belarus, but they are preparing for a defensive war, not an aggressive one. So what's the core issue? Now, taking everything that has been said into account, let's answer a simple question. Why, 4 years after the battle near Kyiv, has the topic of an attack by Belarus come up again? And as I see it, there are only 3 most likely options. This could be a classic Russian Psy-Op to increase Ukrainian troop deployment on the Belarus border. And not just an increase, but an increase by redeploying Ukrainian soldiers from the front to the north. In other words, Moscow's ultimate goal is to weaken Ukraine's defensive capabilities by reducing the total number of troops along the line of contact. Plus, it could divert attention from another front, for example in the Kharkiv or Sumy regions. So in this case, we're dealing with classic force-fixing tactics. Russia is using Belarus as a demonstration platform, forcing Kyiv to divert troops from heavy defensive battles in Donbass and Zaporizhzhia. It's as simple as that. The second option is Psy-Ops, but this time it's Ukrainian, with the exact opposite goal: to provoke the redeployment of at least some Russian troops from Donbass to guard the border with Belarus. The scheme is quite workable. The main thing is for Moscow to fall for it, although most likely Putin won't stop the offensive and will try to plug the gap with some other forces. For example, he might use North Korean fighters again, as he did 2 years ago in the Kursk region, to avoid mobilizing his own people. The gatherer of Russian lands asked Comrade Kim III for a bit of cannon fodder, and he, being a kind soul, couldn't refuse his buddy. The third option is that this is a joint Ukrainian-European information campaign aimed at preventing closer ties between Belarus and the United States, whose relations have significantly warmed recently, amid the mustachio dictator's showy release of political prisoners, including Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's husband. The ubiquitous Trump was quick to claim credit for this Belarusian-style mercy, which is quite expected given the lack of real progress on the diplomatic front. However, neither Europe nor Ukraine is pleased with Minsk's closer ties to Trump's Washington, especially after sanctions on Belarusian potash fertilizer exports, once a major source of foreign currency, were lifted. Moreover, both in Brussels and in Kiev, there are serious concerns that in the future Belarus could become a sort of transit hub for the supply of sanctioned goods to Russia, including dual-use items. Therefore, by making statements about preparing an attack, they may be trying to break the connection between Trump and Lukashenko, as well as increase European pressure on Belarus. And what about Belarusian nukes? In general, the possibility of Russia launching a nuclear strike on Ukraine requires a separate and more detailed analysis. I will definitely dedicate a separate video to this very important topic, with the most objective information and balanced points of view on this issue, so don't forget to subscribe. And now let's focus exclusively on Belarus. So, to begin with, let me point out that there is no such thing as Belarusian nuclear weapons. There are only Russian nuclear weapons that Putin has deployed on the territory of Belarus. Just like there is no such thing as German or Turkish nuclear weapons. It's just that, at one time, the US deployed its warheads in response to the threat of a Soviet attack as a means of deterring potential communist aggression. Now let's get back to Belarus. In 2023, that is, in the second year of the full-scale war, Putin deployed tactical nuclear weapons, meaning weapons of relatively low yield. And as for their delivery systems, the Su-25 aircraft and the Iskander-M operational tactical missile systems, which, as we know, launch ballistic missiles. This step by Moscow was unprecedented because at one time Belarus, as well as Ukraine and Kazakhstan, gave up the nuclear weapons they inherited from the USSR. And now everything has come full circle. In fact, Putin has turned Belarus into a staging ground for potential aggression against European NATO countries. Yes, you heard that right. Nuclear weapons in Belarus are a major geopolitical signal, but it's not directed at Ukraine at all. It's aimed at NATO, more specifically at its European members. This is evidenced both by the specific locations of the warheads themselves, mainly in the western regions, Brest and Grodno oblasts, and by the range of these missiles from 500 to 1,000 kilometers depending on the modification. So, in this case, Russia's nuclear threat primarily concerns Poland and the Baltic states, which is especially relevant in the context of a possible war in the Suwalki corridor area. I also made a separate video about this possibility, with a detailed analysis of all the scenarios. As for the nuclear exercises that took place in Belarus in May and scared many Ukrainian commentators, I want to reassure you that such events are held annually. The previous ones were in the summer of 24 and the fall of 25, and most importantly, nuclear exercises are not nuclear tests, don't confuse them. An exercise does not involve an actual nuclear explosion, only its simulation. So there was no nuclear mushroom cloud over the Belarusian forests, and I hope there never will be. In any case, not in our lifetime. In short, Russian nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus are a serious and potentially dangerous thing. But it is unlikely to directly affect the course of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The warheads located in Russia itself pose a much greater danger to Ukraine. However, that's a completely different topic for discussion. That's all from me. Thank you for watching and thank you for sharing the video. Please support the channel financially. See you in future videos. Bye everyone. Пока.